So, King Charles literally pulled an emergency kill switch on the palace network from inside his dressing room, and the entire institution went dark for hours while he rewrote his will in secret. That's not a metaphor. That's not tabloid exaggeration. The King of England used a Cold War-era hardware override to cut his own staff off from the central servers because he didn't want anyone monitoring what he was about to sign, and the document he signed could fundamentally alter who gets what in the House of Windsor, potentially forever. Before we get into the absolute madness of how this all went down, if you enjoy deep dives into royal drama that actually explain what's happening behind the palace walls, hit subscribe, because you're going to want to be here when the next chapter of this story breaks. So let's start with the image that's been stuck in my head since I first heard about this. It's a freezing Tuesday morning in late 2025 at Sandringham House. The King's private secretary, Sir Clive Alderton, opens a heavy leather dispatch box in the library. Inside is a single sheet of heavy vellum carrying the sovereign's private cipher. 5 lines of coded text appear to describe an ordinary property matter, but they don't. The document contains a legal trigger directing the keeper of the privy purse to freeze the distribution records of the sovereign's personal investment portfolio. And that's where everything begins. Under an agreement dating back to 1993, the private wills of deceased British monarchs are sealed from public view for decades. But the document Charles was working with wasn't simply a will waiting to be opened after his death. It was an active amendment designed to alter the distribution of non-crown assets while he was still alive and still reigning. That distinction changes everything. Within minutes of the king reviewing the document, the communication systems at Sandringham suddenly shut down. Every terminal went blank. The technicians tried to reboot the local server, but their administrator codes were rejected. The estate was effectively cut off from Buckingham Palace. At first, staff believed they were dealing with a cyber attack. Then they discovered the real reason. A physical hardware override switch had been manually activated from inside the king's private dressing room. Charles had used a physical master key, a redundant security system created during the Cold War, to sever the estate's external network connection. He didn't want his digital activity monitored by the central palace network while the legal document was being prepared. Think about that. The reigning monarch had physically disconnected his own estate from the palace network to keep what he was doing private. And while the network remained down, something even stranger happened. The king's personal physician, Dr. Michael Dixon, emerged from the private quarters carrying a sealed leather pouch. He handed it directly to a waiting courier. No ordinary travel record was filed. No one outside the inner circle appeared to know where the documents were going. Meanwhile, in London, William's office noticed something was wrong. The shared financial tracking system had suddenly stopped receiving information from Sandringham. William tried calling his father's personal mobile. Nothing. He contacted the estate switchboard and was told the king was resting and had ordered that he not be disturbed, including by family members. That was when concern turned into panic. Because if Charles was changing the future distribution of his personal estate without William's involvement, the entire transition plan for the monarchy could be affected. Sandringham and Balmoral were not simply symbolic residences, they were personal properties rather than crown estate assets, and they represented hundreds of millions of pounds in real estate and family wealth. While William's advisors scrambled in London, Charles sat alone in his study at Sandringham. An open leather ledger lay on the desk. He picked up his fountain pen and began making the final adjustments to the inheritance schedule. The courier carrying the sealed pouch was already heading toward a private legal office in Norwich, and the financial records involved were enormous. They reportedly included corporate bonds, blue-chip equities, and other private holdings managed for decades by a small group of trusted trustees. Now, Charles was redirecting those assets. William's legal team immediately began examining the historical charters governing the separation between private royal funds and state assets. Their concern was simple. If the king moved certain assets away from the primary line of succession, William's future financial independence could be dramatically reduced. Then came another confirmation. A banking contact in Zurich reported that a transfer of ownership had been submitted shortly before the Sandringham network went dark. The transfer involved historical gold bullion held in trust for descendants of King George V. Suddenly, this looked much bigger than an inheritance disagreement. It looked like a restructuring of the family's private financial architecture. Back at Sandringham, security tightened. The upper floor was locked. Only people with direct clearance could enter. Rumors began circulating among staff that Charles had discovered an old directive from Queen Elizabeth II concerning the family's private jewelry and other assets. William cross-referenced the relevant records, and what he found appeared to confirm that his grandmother had left an emergency provision allowing the reigning monarch to reallocate certain non-state assets during an exceptional family crisis. Charles wasn't simply ignoring the rules. He was using an emergency mechanism that had apparently been created specifically for such circumstances. At exactly 1 p.m, the courier reached the legal office in Norwich. The leather pouch was handed to a senior partner, the signatures were verified, and within minutes, the amendment was formally executed. But the story didn't end in England. Hours later, a duplicate copy arrived in Montecito, California. The paperwork directly targeted the financial provisions associated with Prince Harry and his descendants. The amendment reportedly changed the residency requirements attached to certain future trust payments. Under the new rule, beneficiaries maintaining a primary tax residence outside the British Isles for more than 5 consecutive years could lose access to the core trust principal. Instead, the money would return to the general pool associated with the Duchy of Lancaster. The timing appeared designed to correspond with Harry's departure from active royal duties in 2020. And then came an even more aggressive clause. Any legal challenge from a disqualified beneficiary could potentially trigger disclosure of private financial audits connected to their post-royal commercial activities. In other words, challenging the amendment could bring unwanted financial scrutiny. Harry's legal representative received the filing and immediately sought clarification. The response was that the amendment had been executed under the king's personal property authority, placing it outside ordinary family disputes. Then another item appeared in the asset schedule. A historic diamond and ruby tiara associated with Diana had disappeared from the private inheritance listing. The explanation was even more significant. The king had reclassified the piece as an official diplomatic gift rather than personal property. That meant it could become part of the state collection and could no longer simply be inherited as private family property. The amendment also referenced private letters written by Harry during his school years. Those letters were reportedly transferred under a new copyright arrangement, giving William control over their publication. The implications were enormous. The California branch of the family had spent years building financial independence. Now, an old legal structure was being used to place new barriers around that independence. Back in Norfolk, William decided he had to confront the situation personally. He boarded a helicopter. But instead of continuing toward London, the aircraft received instructions to land near Sandringham. William arrived to discover that the upper floor had been placed under medical isolation. The central elevator was disabled, the security doors were locked, and when William attempted biometric access, he discovered something shocking. His emergency access privileges had been erased from the system. His own father had effectively locked him out of the residence. William contacted Scotland Yard. The response was that police command had not ordered the change. The modification had come from an administrative terminal operating under the keeper of the privy purse. Charles had used his sovereign authority to temporarily override the normal security hierarchy. William then saw Sir Clive Alderton carrying a locked leather dispatch case. A blue diplomatic transit tag was attached to it. The documents were apparently being prepared for transport outside the normal British legal system. William knocked on the security door. Clive looked at him through the glass, but refused to open it. Instead, he displayed a signed executive order from Charles commanding staff to maintain operational silence until the documents had left the estate. William realized that any further confrontation could create an institutional crisis, so he retreated to the library. There, he examined the historical charters governing royal property. The numbers were becoming clear. If Charles moved personal assets into protected trusts, William could inherit the throne without inheriting unrestricted control over the family's private wealth. He wouldn't simply inherit money, he would inherit restrictions. Then came the final stage. 3 witnesses arrived at Sandringham to formally validate the amendment. They included a senior judge, the Chancellor of the Diocese of Norwich, and a constitutional historian. The master copy was placed on a reading desk. William challenged the document, arguing that certain family heirlooms required additional verification. But the palace legal team had already obtained the necessary certification. Then another complication emerged. A portion of the assets being redistributed appeared to overlap with William's own estate. For a moment, it looked as though Charles might have exceeded his authority. But Sir Clive produced a property agreement signed by William himself in 2023. Buried inside that agreement was a clause allowing the reigning monarch to reallocate equivalent value non-land assets during a family restructuring. William had unknowingly signed away another potential avenue of resistance. At 4:20 in the afternoon, Charles entered the room. Leaning on his silver-topped cane, he walked to the desk, picked up his fountain pen, and signed the final page. The 3 witnesses followed. One by one, they added their signatures. The entire process took less than 3 minutes. No argument, no confrontation, no words between father and son. The amendment was now formally executed. But William soon received another shock. A secure call came from the keeper of the privy purse. Several major overseas investment files had automatically been locked. The affected funds included capital reserves connected to the Duchy of Lancaster. William demanded to know where the money had gone. A short time later, the answer arrived. Charles had not simply hidden the money or transferred it overseas. Instead, the offshore balance had been placed into a permanent endowment dedicated to maintaining and restoring historic state apartments at Windsor Castle and Holyrood Palace. The move meant the funds could no longer simply be diverted into personal accounts or family settlements. They had been locked into the institution itself. William looked out across Sandringham as the fog began to lift. The staff moved quietly through the building. Everyone seemed to understand that something fundamental had changed. The old rules of compromise no longer applied. The relationship between the sovereign and the heir was now governed by property deeds, trust clauses, legal agreements, and security protocols. William closed his laptop and packed his papers. He walked past the portraits of his ancestors and understood what his future reign might look like. He would inherit the throne, but he might also inherit a financial structure deliberately redesigned to limit his freedom of action. As William's helicopter lifted away from Sandringham, the estate disappeared beneath the gray Norfolk sky. The building looked completely still. But behind those walls, the House of Windsor had supposedly redrawn its own internal borders, and the consequences of that rainy Tuesday morning could echo through the family for generations.